The list was typed. That was the first thing I noticed. Not a phone call, not a conversation over coffee or even a text message with too many words and not enough courage. A printed list, folded in thirds, handed to me by my husband Marcus on a Tuesday evening while I was standing in our kitchen reheating leftover pasta. He came in, set it on the counter without saying anything, and went to stand at the window like he needed to look at the street for a while. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and picked it up. Bold letters at the top. Conditions for Nora's attendance at the WHITMAN Family Legacy Weekend. Below that, numbered 1 through 5. I read all 5. Then I folded the paper back up exactly the way it had been, set it on the counter, and finished reheating my pasta. The microwave beeped. I stirred. I ate standing up because the table had mail on it I hadn't dealt with yet, and I didn't want to move it. Normal things in a normal kitchen while something quietly detonated inside me. That night, lying in the dark after Marcus had finally fallen asleep, I thought about my father. His name was Raymond Caldwell. He died 2 years before Marcus, and I got married, pancreatic cancer, 4 months from diagnosis to the end. He never met the Whitman family. At the time, I thought that was just sad timing. Now I think it might have been the only real mercy. My dad was the kind of man who kept a box of thank you cards in his desk drawer and actually used them. Who remembered the name of your kid's soccer coach from 18 months ago and asked about the championship game. Who would drive 30 minutes out of his way to return something that wasn't his fault. He used to say that a little graciousness costs you nothing and can change everything. I didn't fully understand that until I read that list on my kitchen counter. Gerald Whitman was not a gentle man. He was 67, retired, a former commercial banker out of Charleston, South Carolina. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of man who had a firm opinion about the right way to do most things and wasn't above mentioning it. His handshake was exactly what you'd expect. His suits were tailored. He gave the impression of someone who had spent his entire adult life deciding what belonged in his world and what didn't, and who had become very practiced at the sorting. He'd never liked me. I knew that from the first dinner. I'm a commercial real estate appraiser. I work for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm good at what I do. The nature of the job means I walk into spaces and assess value quickly. I can't always turn that instinct off, even when I'm sitting in someone's dining room on a Sunday evening, being evaluated myself. That first dinner, I looked around the Whitman table and read the room the way I'd read a property. Gerald was the structural anchor, the reason everything in the house held the shape it did. Diane, his wife, had spent 30 years learning which way to lean. Marcus had grown up developing a skill set I'd never needed to develop, how to manage a man who equated control with love. I had not grown up learning to manage anyone, and I didn't think I should have to start at 32. We got through that first dinner. We got through the next 18 months in the way that fine sometimes means. Both sides making accommodations, nobody saying the actual thing, the whole arrangement balanced on a wire everyone pretended not to see. The Whitman Family Legacy Weekend happened every summer. 3 days at the family estate outside Charleston, a property Gerald had inherited from his father, and maintained with the devotion of a man who believed his family name was a living thing that needed regular feeding to survive. Extended family came from across the Southeast, sometimes as far as Virginia. Cousins, aunts, uncles, people who'd married in and people who'd been born in. 15 or 20 people in a house large enough to absorb them and old enough to make you feel small in a specific way. Every year during the weekend, a family trust document was reviewed and signed. Gerald called it tradition. Marcus called it obligation. His grandfather, who was 81 and still had his wits entirely intact, seemed to find the whole ceremony more amusing than significant. Marcus and I had attended twice since we'd been married. The first time I felt like a subject being inspected. The second time, I felt like a subject who had failed inspection and was being given a grace period to correct the problem. That second weekend was when the Christmas incident happened, except it wasn't Christmas. It was the legacy weekend itself, Saturday dinner, and Gerald was holding court on the subject of commercial real estate. The methodology is fairly surface level, he said, reaching for the bread basket. Numbers dressed up as expertise. I put down my fork. That's actually not accurate. Gerald looked at me the way you look at a car alarm that's just gone off across the street. Surprised, then annoyed that you have to deal with it. The USBAP standards were significantly revised in 2023, I said. Income-producing property assessments alone require a level of analysis that most people in finance don't have the background to perform. It's genuinely complex work. Nora, Marcus said. I'm just correcting the record, I said. Diane had become very interested in her salad. Gerald set down his bread and picked up his wine glass. No one said anything. Later, Marcus found me on the back porch. He stood next to me and looked out at the marsh. He's going to remember that, he said. I know. Was it worth it? I don't know yet, I said. Ask me in a year. A year later, Marcus handed me the printed list. That night after dinner, I read the list again in our bedroom. Marcus was in the living room. I could hear the television, muted, the way he kept it when he wasn't really watching. I sat on the edge of the bed and went through all 5 conditions slowly. Condition 1, Nora should resign from her position at her firm and focus on the family. Note, Whitman wives have always understood the importance of presence. Condition 2, prior to the legacy weekend, Nora should complete the 6-week social and etiquette program at the Pemberton Club in Charleston. Gerald had already called ahead to reserve a spot. Condition 3, Nora should offer a formal apology to Diane for the incident at dinner. Condition 4, any children of Marcus and Nora should be raised in the Episcopalian faith and confirmed at St. Michael's Church in Charleston. Condition 5, professionally, Nora should use the name Caldwell rather than Whitman Caldwell. Reasoning, the Whitman name in professional contexts carried a legacy requiring a certain standard of representation. I sat with that for a long time. He wanted me to quit my career, attend etiquette classes like a remedial debutante, apologize publicly for telling the truth, surrender my child's religious future to a man who treated faith primarily as a social credential, and strip myself from my own professional name because apparently I wasn't representing the Whitmans up to standard. In exchange for all that, I would be allowed to attend a gathering at a house where I had never once felt welcome. The last condition was the one that stayed with me longest. Not Whitman Caldwell, just Caldwell. He had found a way to use my father's name as a removal rather than an honor. Marcus came in around 10. He sat in the armchair across from the bed, elbows on his knees, and looked at me. Say something, he said. What does he call the dinner thing? You know what it was. I want to hear how he frames it. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. You embarrassed him in front of the family. I corrected him. He was wrong. I know. In front of his family, who are also your family, and you've never corrected him. That's true, Marcus said. I haven't. We sat with that. Outside, a car went by slowly, its headlights sweeping across the bedroom wall. He printed it, I said. I know. He formatted it, numbered it, folded it in thirds and gave it to you to hand to me. I looked at him. What did you say when he gave it to you? Nothing I'm proud of. Marcus. I said I'd give it to you. He exhaled. I've been carrying it for 6 days trying to figure out how to hand it to you without it being what it is. What is it? He looked at the floor. A test to see if you'll make yourself smaller. I set the paper on the nightstand. Which of these do you think I should agree to? He looked up quickly. None, he said. Not one of them. They're unreasonable and I'm going to tell him that. And the legacy weekend. We'll skip it, both of us. No, I pulled my knees up and sat cross-legged on the bed. That's your grandfather's trust signing. That's your cousins, your aunts. Eleanor, people who actually like you and some who actually like me. And I'm not going to be the reason you cut yourself off from all of that. You're not making me do anything. I know, I'm asking you to go. I paused. I need some time to figure out what I want to do. He came and sat beside me on the bed. We stayed like that for a while, not talking, until it felt like the room had settled a little. Work helped, the way it usually does. That week I drove out to a portfolio review in Mooresville and spent the morning in an older industrial park. A developer was looking at converting to mixed use. The buildings were tired, but the bones were good. I walked the perimeter taking photos and notes, thinking about the access roads and the zoning overlay, and whether the comparable sales would support what the developer was hopping for. When I'm doing site work, I'm not thinking about anything else. The ground under my feet, the measurements, the real and specific value of a physical thing. There's a comfort in that I can't fully explain. Things either support their assessed value or they don't. The work doesn't lie to you. I got back to the office around 3, wrote up my preliminary notes, and called Marcus on the drive home. "I'm not going," I told him, "to the Legacy weekend." "Okay," he said. "I want you to know that's not defeat. I'm choosing not to perform for an audience that's already decided." "I know. And I'm not apologizing for knowing something your father didn't." "Nora, I've never asked you to." "I know you haven't." I watched the highway through the windshield. "Go, Marcus. Take a picture of June's great-great-grandfather in his portrait on the wall. Have a drink with Dennis. Tell Alina I said hi." He was quiet for a moment. "She always asks about you." "I know. She's the only one." 2 weeks before the Legacy weekend, I drove up to Concord to deal with my father's storage unit. I'd been paying the monthly fee for 3 years and had made the trip exactly 0 times. Going through a dead parent's belongings is the kind of thing you put off until the math forces your hand, and the math finally had. The facility was raising rates in August. I either cleared it out now or paid more to keep not dealing with it. I got there on a Saturday morning with a large coffee, a box of trash bags, and no realistic expectations about how I'd feel by noon. Most of what was in the unit was predictable. Old furniture, filing boxes from his insurance business, 20 years of paperwork in numerical order because that was how he operated, a bureau that had been his mother's, a box of Christmas ornaments I hadn't known he'd kept. In the corner, wrapped in a moving blanket, was a watercolor painting of a marsh scene that I remembered from his office wall. I stood and looked at it for a long time. Near the back, on a shelf, was a filing box with personal written on the side in his handwriting. Inside were the things you'd expect. His father's watch, some photos from his 20s, his college diploma, his marriage certificate to my mother from 1981. And underneath all of that, in a plain manila envelope with nothing written on the outside, a single letter. 3 pages, cream stationery, his initials embossed at the top. The date in the upper right corner, 22 years ago. Addressed to Gerald Whitman at a Charleston Street address. I sat down on an overturned plastic crate and read it. It took me a few minutes to understand the context, because no one had ever told me this part of the story. I was a teenager when whatever this was had happened, and it had been kept from me the way certain adult complications get kept from teenagers. But as I read, the picture assembled itself. My father and Gerald had briefly partnered on a small commercial lending venture in the early 2000s, when both of them were in their 40s and trying to grow. It had lasted about 2 years. There were disagreements about strategy, about risk, about money. At some point it became irreconcilable, and it ended badly, and apparently Gerald had said some things during the dissolution that were, if my father's letter was any indication, fairly severe. Because my father's letter was not about those things. My father's letter was gracious. He acknowledged the failure of the partnership without assigning all the blame to either side. He said he understood that Gerald had felt misled on a particular decision, and that he took responsibility for how he'd communicated his reasoning at the time. He said he hoped Gerald wouldn't carry the bitterness forward, because it was a heavy thing, and it got heavier with time. He said he valued what had been good between them in the beginning, and was sorry it had ended the way it did. Near the end, he wrote that Gerald was a capable man, and he had always believed that, and he hoped Gerald would find what he was looking for. And at the very bottom, in the careful handwriting of a man who had taken his time with every sentence, "I don't know what the future holds, But I hope it holds something better than this for both of us. Raymond. He'd written it, addressed it, sealed it, and never sent it. I sat on that plastic crate for a long time, in the dust and the fluorescent light, holding 3 pages of something my father had needed to say, and then decided to keep instead. He'd spent 22 years with this in a box, and Gerald had spent 22 years with the ending that happened instead. Cassie came over that evening. She brought a bottle of Malbec she didn't end up needing to share, since I couldn't drink any of it on account of being 4 months pregnant. She poured generously for herself, and I had sparkling water with lemon, and we sat on the back deck until it got dark. I told her about the list first. All 5 conditions, all the details. Cassie worked in HR at a logistics company in Dilworth. She had a particular talent for listening to things that should provoke outrage and remaining extremely calm, which was either a professional reflex or a personality trait, and I'd stopped trying to figure out which. "That is the most hostile document I've ever heard described," she said. "He formatted it, Times New Roman." "Times New Roman," she shook her head slowly. "Nora. 12-point. Your father-in-law prepared a 12-point Times New Roman list of requirements for letting his pregnant daughter-in-law into his home." "Estate," I said, "technically." She looked at me over her wine glass. "I'm sorry, into his estate." She took a sip. "What does Marcus say?" "He says he's not defending it. He says I should do none of it. He says he'll skip the whole weekend if I want." "But you don't want that." "His grandfather is 81. He has cousins he genuinely likes. The trust signing matters to him for reasons that actually make sense if you understand the family." I looked at the yard. "He shouldn't lose that because Gerald is the way he is." "So you're still protecting him," Cassie said, "from his own family." "I'm making the right call. It also happens to protect him. Those aren't the same thing, but they're not mutually exclusive either." She set down her glass. "So you're not going?" "I'm not going. I'm not apologizing for correcting a man who was wrong. I'm not enrolling in social etiquette classes at a club in Charleston like I'm some kind of remedial project. And I am definitely not dropping my father's name from my professional identity because Gerald Whitman has feelings about representation standards." I picked up my sparkling water. "Those aren't conditions of my marriage. They're the conditions of his approval. And his approval was always conditional anyway." "Good," Cassie said, with the simple emphasis of someone who had been waiting to say that. We stayed quiet for a while. The neighborhood settled into its evening sounds. Someone's dog. A lawnmower somewhere behind us finishing up. "You said there was something else," she said. I told her about the storage unit, about the personal box, about the envelope. She was very still while I described the letter. When I got to the part about it never being sent, she set down her wine and didn't pick it back up. "He never mailed it," she finally said. "He used to write things out when he was upset. To get it out of himself, he called it. Then he'd decide whether it actually needed to be said. But this one he kept, in a sealed envelope, with the address on it." "Yeah," I looked at the fence line. "Part of him always meant to." Neither of us said anything for a moment. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. I looked at the yard, a question with an answer I hadn't said out loud yet, but already knew. Marcus left on a Thursday morning, the last weekend in July. He'd packed the night before, and we'd had a long, quiet conversation at the kitchen table over decaf. The kind where you say the real things without raising your voice, because you both understand the weight of what's in the room. "I want you to know I understand what it costs you," he said. "Not going." "I'm not losing anything I ever actually had," I said. "I was never truly welcome there. Some people in that house. I know, Eleanor, Dennis, a few of the cousins." I wrapped both hands around my mug. "I'm not angry at the house. I'm not angry at you. I'm just not going to perform for Gerald. He's going to say you're being difficult. I'm sure he will. And I'm going to tell him his conditions were out of line." I looked at him. "You're going to say that directly?" "I've been talking around my father since I was 12 years old." He put his coffee down. "I'm tired of it." I put my hand on his arm and left it there. He left just after 6. The house was quiet. I went to work, finished the Mooresville assessment, had lunch at the diner on Central Avenue. Normal Thursday. I drove home in the 4 o'clock traffic and made dinner and watched something forgettable on the couch. After dinner, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's letter in front of me. I read it again, all 3 pages. His voice was all through it, the way someone's handwriting carries their voice when you know them well enough. The careful way he chose words. The instinct to assume the best in people even past the point where the evidence supported it. He'd written to a man who had apparently been quite hard on him, and he'd been kind about it, and the man had never answered. 22 years later, that man's son had married his daughter. And that man had handed his son a printed list. I got a padded envelope from the drawer under the printer. A piece of my own stationery, first name only at the top, just Nora. I wrote 4 sentences. Then I folded my father's letter, placed it in the envelope with what I'd written, sealed it, and addressed it to the Whitman estate in Charleston. Not to Gerald specifically, to the family. I wrote on the outside, "Please read this together." I put it in the mailbox on Friday morning on my way to work. I didn't tell Marcus. I thought about it and decided against it. Either it would be understood or it wouldn't, and an explanation beforehand wasn't going to change that. What I'd written in those 4 sentences was this. My father wrote this letter 22 years ago and never sent it. I found it last week going through his belongings. I think he would have wanted it read eventually. That is all I have to say. Nora Caldwell. Not Whitman Caldwell, not Nora Whitman, just Nora Caldwell. Not because Gerald had asked me to drop the hyphen. That condition, like all the others, I had 0 intention of meeting. I signed it Caldwell because this was my father's letter, and this moment belonged to his name. What happened at the estate that weekend, I learned from Marcus over time. Some of it that night on the phone. The rest in pieces over the weeks that followed, the way these things surface once enough time has passed. The package arrived at the estate on Saturday afternoon, during the quiet hours between lunch and the evening gathering. Gerald and Diane were out picking up his sister from the airport in Charleston. His Aunt Alina, who was actually Gerald's father's sister and had been coming to the Legacy weekend longer than Gerald had been running it, was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea when the mail came. Alina Whitman Bragg was 84 years old and had been a public school teacher in Beaufort County for 4 decades. She had outlived 2 husbands and one of her own children, and she had the particular steadiness that comes from surviving enough that surprise becomes mostly theoretical. When she read something, she read it carefully. When she understood something, she usually knew exactly what to do with it. She read my note, then she read my father's letter. All 3 pages. Then she put it on the kitchen table and went to find Marcus. He was on the back porch with his grandfather, going through old photographs the old man had brought out for the weekend. Alina came to the screen door. "Marcus," she said, "who is Raymond Caldwell?" He looked up. "My wife's father. He passed a few years ago." "Come with me," she said. By 6 o'clock, when the family gathered on the back porch for the pre-dinner hour they always had, most of the extended family was there. Gerald and Diane were back. Dennis, Gerald's brother with his wife Carol, 3 of the cousins, 2 of the younger generation, roughly 15 people in the warm July evening. Alina asked Gerald to sit down. He laughed a little, the way he did when something caught him off balance. "Alina, what is this?" "Sit down, Gerald." He sat. Diane sat beside him. Alina stood near the porch railing with the letter in her hand and read it aloud. She read all 3 pages in her schoolteacher's voice, clear and unhurried, not performing it, just delivering it the way she had delivered 1,000 things to classrooms full of children who needed to understand. My father's words moved through the Lowcountry evening. His careful acknowledgments. His hope that bitterness wasn't the legacy worth carrying. His wish, for both of them, for something better. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to feel earned. Gerald's brother Dennis said, "Whose father was this?" "Nora's father," Alina said. "Raymond Caldwell." "When did he write it?" 2004. Alina folded the letter precisely. He never sent it. His daughter found it last week and sent it instead. Diane said quietly, "Gerald, did you know this man?" Gerald was very still. His face had gone through several changes while Alina was reading and had settled into something no one at the table had a clear name for. "We had a business disagreement," he said, "years ago." "He wrote you a letter," Alina said. "He offered to put it behind him." She set the letter on the table. "You never answered him." "Alina, I don't think this is the—" "And then his daughter married your son," she said. "And you've spent 2 years finding reasons not to accept her." She looked at him in the way of someone who is not angry but is finished being polite about something. "I'm not going to make a speech about it, Gerald. I just thought the family should know." Marcus stayed for dinner. He told me later that leaving dramatically seemed like the wrong thing, and Alina had made her point without needing anyone to storm out. So he sat and ate and listened to the cousins talk about their kids and someone's kitchen renovation, and the traffic on I-26, the way families talk when they're collectively agreeing not to address the thing that just happened. Gerald was quiet through most of dinner. He ate. He answered direct questions. He didn't hold court the way he usually did. After dinner, Marcus went for a walk. He ended up at the parking area on the side of the house, sitting on the hood of his rental car, looking at the old oak trees going dark in the evening. He called me around 9:30. I picked up on the second ring. "Hey," I said. "Hey," a pause. "Did you know Alina was going to read it?" "No, I just addressed it to the family and hoped someone would know what to do with it." He was quiet for a moment. "She read the whole thing. Everyone was there." "Marcus." "He never answered your dad," he said. "He let that sit for 22 years and then handed me a list of conditions to give to you." "Yeah. Your dad wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he hoped Gerald would find what he was looking for." His voice was steady, but just barely. "And Gerald just, nothing." "Some people can't receive grace," I said. "It makes them feel like they owe something." The crickets were loud through the phone. A car somewhere in the distance. "He's been aiming at you since you walked in the door," Marcus said. "Not because of dinner, because of who your father was." "I know. I didn't know. I should have figured it out sooner." Another long pause. "I'm coming home tomorrow." "You don't have to leave early on my—" "I want to come home." His voice was simple. "That's all." "Okay," I said. "Okay," he said. He drove back on Sunday. We didn't make it into anything. He came in and set his bag down, and I made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we always did on Sunday mornings. Later, we took a walk through the neighborhood, no destination, just moving through the summer air with our arms occasionally brushing. He told me the rest of it slowly, in the order things came back to him. The moment Alina finished reading, the look on Dennis's face. Carol, Dennis's wife, who had pulled Marcus aside before he left to say she'd always liked me and thought the whole thing had been handled wrong from the beginning. "You have more people over there than you think," he said. "I don't need more people anywhere. I just needed my dad's letter to exist somewhere other than a box." "Did he ever tell you about Gerald? About what happened between them?" "Not a word." I watched the sidewalk. "That's how he was. He didn't carry things into other rooms." "He wrote him a letter. He needed to get it out of himself. Whether Gerald read it or not wasn't really the point." I paused. "But I thought Gerald deserved to read it eventually. And I thought Alina deserved to know. And I thought your grandfather, at 81 years old, ought to understand what it is he's actually being asked to pass down." Marcus didn't say anything. We walked half a block without talking. "What are you going to do about Gerald?" he finally asked. "Nothing for now. He can do whatever he does with it." "And if he doesn't do anything?" "Then that's his answer, too." Our daughter was born in December, 3 weeks early, on a Tuesday just before midnight when I'd stopped being prepared for anything except what the nurses were telling me and the relentless work of the moment and Marcus's hand, which I may have permanently altered. When she arrived, she was small and had her father's ears, and she cried hard, which they told me was a good sign, and I believed them. We named her June, after my grandmother on my father's side. I called Cassie from the hospital room at 2 in the morning. She cried for both of us. I just looked at June in her clear bassinet under the warming light and felt something enormous and wordless that I filed away to understand later. In February, Gerald called Marcus. Not me, Marcus. He wanted to know if he could send something for the baby. Marcus said yes and called me afterward to give me a heads up. A gift, I said. Yeah, he was, I don't know, quieter than usual on the phone. Okay, I said. A week later, a package arrived from a children's shop in Charleston, the kind of store that wraps things beautifully regardless of what's inside. Inside the tissue paper was a hand-knitted blanket in pale yellow, clearly not from the store, but wrapped as though it deserved the occasion. And folded inside the blanket was a small envelope with my name on the front. Just Nora, not Whitman Caldwell, not Nora Whitman, just Nora. Inside was a card. 3 sentences, Gerald's handwriting. I owe you more than this. I'm not sure I know how to give it yet. I'm sorry about your father. No closing, no signature, 3 sentences and then white space. I read it twice. Then I set it on the dresser in the nursery. I didn't mention it for 2 days. On the 3rd day, I took it downstairs and put it in the kitchen drawer where I keep things I don't want to lose. The drawer with the good scissors and the takeout menus and a thank you note Marcus had written me years ago that I'd never been able to throw away. Not a forgiveness drawer, not a reconciliation drawer, just a place where things go when they mean a little more than ordinary. That evening, after June was asleep, Marcus and I sat on the back deck in the cold. February in Charlotte is mild but not warm, and we were probably being a little unreasonable sitting outside with our coats on. We did it anyway. Did you read the card? I asked. You didn't show it to me. I told him what it said. He nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Do you believe him? I believe he wrote it, I said, which I think, for your father, is as close to honest as he knows how to get right now. That's generous. It's accurate, there's a difference. He set down his coffee. We watched a plane's lights crossing the dark sky, slow and blinking. He's not going to become a different person, Marcus said. I know. He might become a slightly better version of who he is. That might be enough. I pulled my coat tighter. I haven't decided yet. Gerald and Diane came to Charlotte in April. Diane had called Marcus first, and Marcus had told me, and I'd said yes, come for an afternoon. I didn't rearrange anything. I didn't cook anything elaborate. I made a pot of coffee and put store-bought cookies on the counter, and June was in her bouncy seat in the living room wearing an outfit with ducks on it, which she seemed completely indifferent to and which I found entirely winning. Gerald came through the door and stopped in the living room doorway. He looked at June. He said, "She has Marcus's ears." "I know," I said. He sat in the armchair across from her. Diane took pictures with her phone. We had coffee. Gerald looked at June the way people look at infants when they're not quite sure what to do with the particular force of them. After a while, he asked about my work, not offhandedly. He asked the way you ask when you actually want to hear the answer. I told him about a portfolio appraisal I was finishing, a mixed-use project near Lake Norman, nothing dramatic, just the work. He listened. He didn't offer opinions. He asked what made mixed-use valuation complicated from an appraiser's standpoint, and I told him, and he nodded. We didn't talk about the letter. We didn't talk about the list. We didn't have a scene. Before they left, he stopped in the entryway and looked at me. "Your father," he said. "Raymond. He was a better man than I gave him credit for at the time." I waited. There was no but. He just stood there in my entryway with his jacket half on. "I know," I said. He nodded once, finished putting on his jacket. Diane hugged me the way she always did and always meant, and then they were gone. I stood at the window and watched their car back out of the driveway and turn onto the street. Marcus came up beside me. "How do you feel?" I thought about it. "Good tired," I said, "I think." He put his arm around my shoulders. We both turned back toward June, who had decided the bouncy seat was no longer adequate and was making her feelings known. I still think about my father's letter sometimes. 3 pages in a sealed envelope, addressed and stamped unsent, sitting in a box in a storage facility in Concord for 22 years. I used to think it was sad that he never mailed it. Now I think he mailed it when it needed to be mailed, just not by him. He always said a little graciousness costs you nothing and can change everything. Some days it feels like it cost a lot. The year I spent absorbing Gerald's low opinion of me. The dinners I sat through counting the minutes. The careful mental rehearsal before every Whitman event, bracing for the subtle things that still managed to land. But then I think about a leaner Whitman Bragg standing at a porch railing, reading my father's words to people who had never known they needed to hear them. I think about 3 sentences on a card in a kitchen drawer. I think about a man who spent 22 years holding a wound and finally, very quietly, put it down. I think about what my father left behind. He left behind a letter. He left behind his name in mine. He left behind the instinct toward grace, which I didn't always have naturally, but which I've been learning to carry, even when it's heavy. And he left behind me. I used to believe I had to choose between being who I was raised to be and surviving rooms like Gerald's. I've learned that isn't actually the choice. The choice is simpler, and you make it over and over. You decide what goes in the mailbox and what goes in the drawer. You decide which things you carry forward and which things you leave in a box. My name is Nora Caldwell. I'm a commercial real estate appraiser in Charlotte, North Carolina. My husband is Marcus, and our daughter is June, and she sleeps in a yellow blanket that no one in this house will explain to her until she's old enough to ask the right questions. And that's enough. That has always been enough.